All right, so I call this God's War with the Sea, and this is taken by accident at one point from a shiur by Rav Alex. And I say by accident because I thought I gave the shiur of my own accord, give or take 6 years ago. And then like 2 years after that, I was reviewing some old notes from Eretz, and I found that Rav Alex gave the shiur before me, and I was in that shiur from him, and apparently I learned all the material, remembered it, and just did not remember it was from him. So he gets a lot of the credit. And then bits and pieces just got thrown in over time as I realized this theme essentially is one of the most widespread themes throughout the entire Tanakh, showing up just about everywhere. And it is that God seems to go to war with the sea, with the ocean, with the rivers, and a lot. So where we start out is Tehillim, that is Barchi Nafshi. And in particular, some irregularities about the location of the water, right? So there's an emphasis, Barchi Nafshi, just this beautiful description of nature and the various aspects of nature. And in it, we look at the water and we see, so Hashem founded the earth upon its supports, and then such that it shall not falter. So that's the way God built the earth. And we look at what he says at the water. He has tehom, the deep, this sort of, we'll get into it more, but this place of deep water covering the mountains. And that's the sort of primordial state. Ruach Hashem merachepet al pnei hamayim. Everything is covered by water. That's how the world starts out. What does God do? He yells at the water. Min gar tich yanusun, min kol ram tech yechapezun. So the waters essentially flee from God's yelling at them, which itself is interesting. What does it mean for God to yell? What does it mean for the waters to run away? But for our most interesting is Ya'alu harim yerdu vikot el makom ze yisat lahem. So the waters go up and the waters go down. Because the waters don't go to one place, the waters actually go to two. There's waters going up and waters going down. Now, we know water's going down. That makes sense. Oceans, rivers, lakes, these are all down. Water, gravity, down. Nice and simple. Water's going up. Now, that's a little bit less obvious. And it doesn't say they go to the clouds necessarily. I mean, it says they ascend the mountains. So water tends not to operate that way in my version of physics. So what is this? And what we're going to see is actually this theme goes back to the very beginning, goes back to creation, carried its way through in both story and poetry throughout Tanakh. Just sort of more example of this, in source number 2, Tehillim 89:10. So Hashem rules over the sea, and Hashem bends the waves. Again, in Yeshayahu, we have this emphasis. Hashem stirs up the seas into the roaring waves. We constantly have, when Tanakh wants to describe God being powerful, when Tanakh wants to describe nothing holding back God, it's God holding back the sea, and the seas being destructive, but God being more powerful than that. Comes up again in Tehillim, comes up in Yirmiyahu. Just this image of God holding back the sea, setting a border for the sea, and the seas running away, often from God's voice. And what we often in particular see, there's an emphasis as well within how this image gets tied to a couple of other images, forming this sort of complex parallel. Right, so here again in Tehillim 46, we have this description of God's strength, and then we have the waters are rising, but we're not going to be afraid because God's the one who's going to drive back the waters, so we don't have to be afraid of the waters. And then connecting it to God's dwelling place. So over and over again, there's waters rising up, but God holds them back, God drives them back, God yells at them. Again in Eov, just this is Tanakh's way of saying God is powerful, is God drives back the sea. And we've just to show how this comes up everywhere, I called it one version of the title, the Limotif of Tanakh. This is something that just comes up over and over again throughout Tanakh, is God holding back the sea, or God driving back the sea, essentially God going to war with the sea. And there are potentially, for a different shiur, potentially some Near Eastern analogs as to how this fits other Near Eastern religions and the way it's commenting on them and sort of subverting their ideas, but that being for another time. It's not just Tanakh. We see this actually in the Gemara. We see this in multiple Gemaras. I brought one Gemara in Baba Batra, where essentially the waves are coming to challenge God, and they're afraid. And God sets up the sand. They can't even cross the sand. And so, are you really gonna, not be afraid of God? He put the sand. which is essentially to say you go to a beach, you look at the sand, that's a border God created holding back the sea. That's Baba Batra's conception of the sea and of the sand, and it really emerges directly from Yirmiyahu. Now the question is, where is this idea coming from? Why is God fighting war against the sea? Right? Meaning lions also, want to eat us, but we don't really find God fighting war with lions. We don't have all the other destructive forces of nature. They're described. They're represented in Tanakh. They're also used to emulate God's creation. But it's very rare that God is yelling at them, that God is striking them, God is holding them back, and that they're even portrayed as rebellion. Right? The sea is essentially fighting against God, and the question being why. And it goes back to it essentially is the natural state of the earth, because there's a problem. The natural state of the earth is there's no land and everything is covered by water. Right? Very, very, very beginning, truly as close to the beginning as it gets. Breshit, Parak 1, Pasuk Bet. So there's nothing, everything is chaos, void, absolute nothingness, except there's the Spirit of God and there's water. Key for our points, there's water. So in the very, very beginning of the absolute nothingness, somehow there's water. And the Gemara gets into what is this tohu, what is vahu. If you can understand what this Gemara means, you're more mystical than I. But what's very clear is the Gemara also emphasizes somehow water has this primordial existence prior to anything else coming into existence. There's water. However, then when God creates, of course, God splits the water into upper and lower waters, that being rather standard. What's most surprising is the way God creates land, because God doesn't create land, right? You might think, okay, day 3, God creates land. So when you actually read the psukim, what it is yikvu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el makom echad v'tera'eh hayavasha v'yehi chen. God gathers back the waters, and you can see and then the dry land emerges. Which is there's no actual act. God created land. The implication is land already existed. There was always essentially like dryness in the earth. There was always dry land, but everything was covered by water. So that's the picture that emerges of creation. And now what happens? God creates land by holding back the waters. He gathers them up into a particular place. Now we're going to have to examine what it means to gather them up, because due to gravity, water always wants to go down. It's not obvious how one holds water in a particular location. Right? There aren't just sort of magic walls of water being held in place. So you have to explore what that's going to mean for the waters to be gathered up. But that's how land is created. And so now we think about it. Why is God holding back the waters? Because this is how the earth was created. The earth was created by God gathering back the waters, which means the natural state of everything is water. Everywhere, all the time, always. That's the natural state. And what we saw in the very beginning is, what does God do? In creation, we have God coming, and God drives the waters back. The waters go up, the waters go down, the waters are held back. And from that, the earth exists. And then, Vul Samta Bal Yavrum. So God created a boundary that the waters cannot cross. And that's why the earth exists. Bal Yeshavun Lechasot Haaretz, so that they don't come and cover up the water, cover up the land. But what then emerges from other parts of Tehillim is that they want to. These waters are aggressive and want to come cover the land. So, and so that there we see in the other places, right? Hashem doesn't just hold it. It's not just a sort of static, one time God gathered the waters and they stay there. We have present tense. Ata moshel bagayotayam. God, you continuously reign over the haughtiness and as well as the highness of the seas. The seas raise up their waves, and what do, God? You break them. So it's not just one time God gathered, it's every time a wave is coming, the image is the wave comes to cover the earth, and God breaks it. As we saw before, the Gemara quotes the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, that there's the sand as a border from the water coming over it. And what does that mean? It means every time a wave from the ocean comes and crashes against the sand, we're supposed to see that metaphorically, or to some extent, as God basically currently holding back the water. The water is trying to cross its border. The water wants to come up on land because the water belongs on land. But what does God do? I have a little bit of sand, and you, water, can't cross that. And we see it. Obviously, what's actually going on in the physics is more complicated. But what it looks like to our eyes, if you look at an ocean, it looks like the ocean is trying to come up onto the land, and then it gets stopped somewhere in the sand. And that's exactly what the Gemara is saying. And the Gemara and Tanakh impute this to a much broader process. It's not just all right, this is the physics of the water crashing as gravity pulls the wave down. We should see this natural state, conceptually at least, as water wants to cover everything. And then sand holds it back, but really God places the sand that holds it back. And we saw earlier, God breaks the waves. God's constantly ensuring dryness. God's constantly ensuring the world exists. And that's why we have a world. And that's why constantly, dependably, there is dry land and the water doesn't cover everything, except when it did. Because there's one time when God stopped holding back the waters. And it didn't go very well for mankind. Right? Continuing in Bereshit. So, Vaisakru amayanot hatahom va'arubot hashamayim v'kalei hageshem min hashamayim. So suddenly now, God, sorry, skip one. When God created the flood, so in the times of Noah, God brings the flood, and he says, Nikvu kol mayanot hatahom rabba va'arubot hashamayim niftachu. Waters come and flood the earth. That's classic. But you pay attention to where the waters come from. They come from the expected place. Arubot hashamayim, right? That's rain. God opens up a window in the sky. That's basically all the water that's been gathered up in the sky, all of day 2 of creation, back down to the earth. The upper waters coming back down. But also the lower waters are coming up. Nikvu kol ma'ayanot tahom. So this idea of this sort of like either groundwater or the tahom, somehow this sort of like deep reservoir of water beneath the earth is suddenly bursting up. And the flood isn't just rain. The flood is actually the waters from above and the waters from below meeting in the middle and completely undoing both day 2 and day 3 of creation. It undoes day 3 because the waters are no longer strained, and it undoes day 2 because now you have the upper and the lower waters meeting once again. And the same thing when the flood is undone, God undoes the flood by once again damming up the lower waters and closing up the windows of the sky. So we see clearly as Tanakh has this perspective of upper and lower waters, and that was what we saw from the very beginning moments of creation, undone by the flood, which very, very much shows basically Hashem saying, "You've corrupted my world. I'm taking it all back. I'm basically destroying the whole thing and starting over." And God doesn't just destroy it with a flood. God destroys it with a flood, which symbolizes undoing the steps of creation. All of animal life destroyed, the earth destroyed. Day 2, the waters once again meeting, and also it became dark because the clouds blotted out everything. So essentially the flood was undoing of creation, and it's particularly apparent within what happens with the waters. And now that being essentially, that's the unique case, right? The flood is a one-time event, but the constant other than that, right? The flood is basically the exception that proves the rule that generally dry land exists because generally God continues to hold back those waters. So the fact that right now I'm in a classroom that's dry and not 20 feet underwater is because we're supposed to see it as God is currently holding back the waters and stopping them from flooding the earth. And as we're going to see, this is something that 100 years ago wouldn't have actually been as appreciable. But now with global warming and rising sea levels, something we're much more cognizant of, and something that gives us some greater insight potentially into how these things could work, right? With the idea of sea levels not being this fixed primordial thing that can never be changed. So we now know that's very much not true. There were times when the entire earth was covered in water. And the very fact that it currently isn't is because the waters are blocked up. In what way? So the Tahom, this deep recess of water that's sort of eternally blocked off, could be glacial ice, could be deep reservoirs of groundwater sort of beneath the Earth's mantle. There are various sort of literal physical ways that this could play out. What very clearly emerges from Tanakh and from the Gemara is we shouldn't take dry Earth for granted. On the contrary, we should be incredibly grateful that God is currently continuing to allow creation to exist and to sustain itself such that we have dry Earth. And this is why, so number one, this is why it's a constant image of God's strength, right? We saw over and over again throughout Tehillim, Eov, Nevi'im, when they want to talk about God's continual enduring strength, it's God created the earth and the earth still exists. God holds back the waters. We see it in Tehillim. We see it in Yeshayahu. God has made firm the earth. God breaking the waves. God beating them back. And in particular, it's in Tehillim more than anything because Tehillim, right? It's about praising God, right? So it's not just okay, the world exists and I take that for granted. Tehillim's response is the world exists. God is holding it back. God is holding it firm, and therefore, I thank Him. And that's Tehillim's expression. And my favorite expression of this both because it gets, I'm constantly able to be reminded of it, as well as just because I think the poetic imagery here is just so incredibly wonderful and so incredibly sonic. In Tehillim 93, Hashem Malach, this is Shir Shel Yom on Fridays, as well as part of Kabbalat Shabbat. And here, just pay attention to the sounds that are described by the words. Hashem Malach Geut Lavesh, Adonai Malach Geut Lavesh, Lavesh Adonai Oz Hitazar, Aftikon Bal Tevel, Aftikon Tevel Bal Timut. So Hashem has reigned, he has donned splendor, he has worn strength, and he has girded himself with strength. And he has made firm the earth which shall not falter. So that very first image is just strength and stability, right? It's God, it has just embraced every form of strength. And the earth is something firm that cannot shake. Nachon kisecha me'az me'olam ata. Again, another verb illustrating firmness, right? It's tichon in the first and nachon, the same shoresh in pasuk bet. Hashem has made the earth firm, and now it's the image of a throne, which is a further image of stability, and it's forever. But then in pasuk 3, it shifts in the exact opposite direction. Nasu neharot Adonai, nesu neharot kolam, yusu neharot dochiam. The rivers raise up. The rivers raise up their voices. The rivers raise up their destructiveness. It's the opposite of the image of strength. It's the opposite of the image of stability. It's the image of strength, but strength of destruction. It's the rivers being loud and powerful and dangerous. And what do we say? Mi kolot mayim rabim adirim mishburayam adir bamarom Adonai. More than the powerful waves, more than the breakers of the sea, is Hashem who is on high. Now that word mikolot is tricky because a mem can mean two things. A mem can mean from, or a mem can mean more than. And here it means both. So here it would mean the more obvious read is more than. Right? As strong as the seas are in pasuk 3, the waves are not as strong as Hashem. Hashem is stronger than the most powerful waves, the many waters, because Hashem, powerful on high, Hashem in heaven, is more powerful than anything the waves, anything the rivers can throw at him. But the other read, mikolot, from the powerful waters. That is, from the fact that these waters are powerful, are loud, are strong. From that, we see that Hashem is Adir Bamarom. From that, we see that Hashem is high and powerful and on high. Why? Because the louder the wave is when it crashes against the floor of against the bed of the ocean, the louder the river is when it rushes up against the banks but doesn't overtake it. As the louder and more destructive every source of water is on earth, the greater evidence we have of God's power in creating this earth, because God made tichon tevel bal timot. God made the powerful earth that shall not shake, that shall not falter. And no matter how destructive, or the more destructive and the louder all these sources of water, all these sources of destruction are on earth, the more we see and thank God for making the earth in this way. And edotecha ne'emnu me'od leveitcha nava kodesh Adonai le'orach yamin. And then we get into a new element. Hashem, your testimonies are essentially faithful or trustworthy, and to your house, to your holy abode, we shall go, Hashem, for eternal days. We suddenly connect this to the Beit HaMikdash and to Edotecha. What are Edotecha? So God's testimonies, often a reference to the Torah. Here, it seems likely it's a reference to a specific detail of the Torah. Which specific detail? The one that we read. Breshit, starting with Breshit, pasuk bet, continuing with Breshit, psukim hey through Zion. The edut, the fact that God described how the earth was created as drawing back the waters and holding them, and then Hashem continually holding them in place, as well as God's edut that He will never again bring a flood. So when we say edotecha ne'emnu ma'od, so it could be referring to the Torah as a whole, but it seems likely that it's focusing specifically on the fact that Hashem has told us this is how water will continue to function, and that has indeed held true that this is how water has continued to function. And wherein things then get particularly interesting is, up until now we focused on strength and stability and destruction, and then the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash is the last piece of the puzzle. It's not obvious how it fits in until you realize it was actually everywhere in the sources we had been looking at in the beginning. To go back to the top, Hashem made firm the earth. He said to Zion, you are my people. We go from made from the earth to Tzion, the place of the Beit HaMikdash. Tehillim, we talk about Hashem breaking the waters, and Beitcha Kodesh Heichal Lecha. We again can tie it instead to contrast it with the firmness of the Beit HaMikdash, the firmness of the Heichal. We see it again in Mishkanei Elyon, Hashem's sort of higher dwelling, and Ir Elokim, Yerushalayim. Right? There's these destructive waters in Pasuk Gimel, and yet we're fine because we're in the Beit HaMikdash and Hashem keeps us safe there. That's Hashem's city, and therefore we'll be okay. So this constant destruction is contrasted with the Beit HaMikdash. We still have to examine why, but it's coming up over and over again. And all of these sources talking about this destructiveness of the rivers, many of them then turn to the Beit HaMikdash. And the answer to a large extent actually is that shoresh of chaf vav nun, kun, to establish. Tichon, teva baltimot, nachon, established. That same shoresh is actually found throughout descriptions of the Beit HaMikdash. If you do a basic search on Safaria or through a concordance, places where chaf vav nun comes up, I think like half of them have to do with the Beit HaMikdash. A very large chunk also have to do with Malchut Beit David. And that is, if you look at particularly when Shlomo was building the Beit HaMikdash, chaf vav nun comes up over and over and over again. The Beit HaMikdash is firm and established. Now, it's not just talking about Shlomo's foundations. What it's talking about is the Beit HaMikdash as Hashem's place on earth. And this gets particularly embraced and particularly seen when we look at particularly through certain midrashic lenses. And among the places we see it is there's the idea of the foundation stone, that from the place of the Beit HaMikdash, depending on which sources you look at, either the Kodesh Kodashim or the Makom HaMizbeach, is the place from which the earth was created. So it makes sense that when we talk about the earth being the symbol of stability, we're going to tie that to the place from which all of that stability emerged. Right? We call it the Even Hashtiyah, the foundation stone, because sort of Jewish thought, particularly mystical thought, sees it as the foundation of the earth. So we're talking about the idea that God has created the earth so it does not shake, so that no waters can shake it up in any way. So it makes sense that the place that we think of when we think about how God created the world in that way is the place from which God created the world in that way, and then which continues to endure as the symbol of God creating the world in that way. And it comes up as well in various midrashim. Particularly, the particular famous midrash comes up both in Sukkah 53a, as well as again in Makot, so it comes up even twice, and then a variant in the Yerushalmi, which plays with it, and a couple of other variants as well, is the idea that somehow or another, David was doing something in the Beit HaMikdash, and that caused a flood. It caused a flood that almost destroyed the entire world. It's like, again, you imagine David thinking, did I really just accidentally repeat, Dor HaMabul? And that's exactly what David almost did. David's digging the foundations of the Beit HaMikdash, and it caused a flood that almost tried to destroy the entire world. And that same image we've been seeing, a flood covering the world. And what does David do? So in this particular version, we have David reciting Shir Amal, and that causes the waters to subside. However, then the Gemara alters it and says, what did David do? He wrote Hashem's name on a shard of pottery, threw it in, and that caused the waters to subside. And then what did David do? Then he sang Shir Amal. Because it wasn't enough that David caused the waters to go down. Causing the waters to go down is a problem because we need the waters. So David caused the waters to go back up. And he's saying the exact number of Shir Amalot needed, right? Each one raising the waters 1,000 amot is trying to get to this idea of the waters need to be this exact right place. And what is this? What essentially is that saying? Look at that very last bit. And then the Gemara has this very interesting line. Don't we see that when we dig a little bit, then water still emerges? So Rav Masharshia says that's because the Euphrates has a rather high water level. And that actually opens up the key to the deeper meaning of this Gemara. What that Gemara is saying is it's really important that the waters be at the proper level. The classic midrash about this is from the context of rain. With Choni HaMa'agel, there the Gemara talks about how he needed to be the exact right amount of rain. Too much rain, everything is destroyed. Too little rain, the crops can't grow. This Gemara comes and says, same thing is true about water under the ground. Water under the ground, if it goes too low, there won't be any sources of water. What's the most fertile area that's within the Middle East? You have the Nile and the Euphrates, and that's because they have their water sources not too high that there's no land whatsoever, but high just enough that the waters reach up, touch the land, give it sort of fertile water, and then it stays. So David couldn't just bring the waters down; he had to bring them back up so they'd be at the exact right height. And a message that emerges from all of this is one of balance. Because what's true of waters, true of the upper waters, true of the lower waters, and it seems that it's true of all good things as well. That is, if there's too much of a good thing, right, too much of anything, it can be destructive, just like too much rain. If there's too little, then we lack basic necessities. We lack food. We lack water. Joy. Anything good in the world must come in exact balance. David comes and sort of davens to restore that balance. And doing that, where is the place where all this occurred? In the Beit HaMikdash. Because what's the place where we come to God to daven that things should be established in the exact proper order, in proper balance? In the Beit HaMikdash. That's where we come to daven to God. And it's so fitting. Well, what are we doing? We're coming to God to daven for God to establish balance in the earth. And what is the Beit HaMikdash this place of? It's this place which is the symbol of God creating balance on earth. The waters being perfectly balanced gets symbolized within the mikdash. Right? That's the place that was constantly associated by these various prakim of Tehillim. God created the world, and I thank God in His Beit HaMikdash. What's the source of God's stability? Chun kaf vav nun, stability, Beit HaMikdash. And what then comes and says, so what do? We come to the Beit HaMikdash to daven for stability, for balance, that all the good things that we need, rain as the quintessential example of that, particularly in the ancient world, must come in exact balance and exact stability. Now, I'll note sort of going simply if anyone wants to read further. So I have, I guess I call them bonus sources here, where you can see how these images come up through further sources in Judaism, particularly within Tanakh. There's particularly an emphasis, God's name gets tied into it. In the Gemara, David caused the waters to descend by writing God's name on a piece of pottery. So God's name is really the additional piece of this puzzle. So you can take a look at the sources for further reading. And that too is, in very brief, is the symbol of God's presence on earth being His name. And it's God's presence that causes all this wonderful balance and all these good things that we have. All right. I thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed. And I guess on to whoever's next.
Thank you. All right.
No problem. You're still on.